Але це вже тема іншої доповіді. Останній, будь ласка, слайд. Я тільки хочу сказати, що коли наші батьки уходять у вічність, ми залишаємося для того, щоб продовжувати їхню справу. І сьогоднішня наша конференція фактично є свідченням того, що це відбувається. Дякую.
Дякую. Це була Марина СКОК. І дійсно, друзі, від себе добавлю, що коли я читаю, чим кожен з вас займається, я розумію, що ви робите надважливу і надскладну роботу, і тому вам за це низький уклін, що присвячуєте усе своє життя розвитку української науки. А ми йдемо далі, друзі, і своїми спогадами про академіка Володимира СКОКа поділиться професор Джон Хорн, якого вже раніше згадували, із медичного інституту університету Пітсбургу, США. Увага на екран.
Medicine, Department of Neurobiology. I'm joining you today as we remember the 90th birthday of our colleague and friend, Volodymyr SKOK. Volodymyr made many important contributions to autonomic neuroscience, to Ukrainian neuroscience, and to the world of neuroscience. I first met him many years ago, in 1987, at an international meeting of the International Brain Research Organization, IBRO, that was held in Budapest, Hungary. At the time, I was already aware of his work, largely because of a book that he published in 1973 on the organization of the autonomic system, the physiology of autonomic ganglia. And so I was aware of him. And over the years, the work that came out of the SKOK lab had a tremendous impact on my own work on the synaptic physiology and organization of sympathetic ganglia. One of the first discoveries that he made, that the SKOK lab made, was on the organization of the paravertebral sympathetic system in frogs. He discovered in the 1960s that there was a separation of the so-called B and C preganglionic systems that innervate the lumbar sympathetic ganglia in frogs. And this turned out to be a really useful discovery that in my work and other people's work was used extensively over the years, because it turned out that the B and C systems, although they were originally named after the conduction velocities of the axons, were functionally distinct. The B system was a secretomotor system that was selectively controlling targets in the skin, and the C system was a vasomotor system that controlled the tone of blood vessels in the skin and its striated muscle. And all of this work started because one was able to succeed because of the discovery that the SKOK lab made. Another important contribution that his lab made was to pioneer in the intracellular recording of membrane potential from sympathetic neurons in vivo, in living animals. And this gave us some of our first information about synaptic activity in this system. And this too became information that was extremely important for work in my lab on integration in sympathetic ganglia. And a third thing that came out of the SKOK lab, there were many more, but a third thing that was influential was his lab was really amongst the first to voltage clamp and record synaptic currents, nicotinic synaptic currents from sympathetic ganglia, and then also to record single channel nicotinic currents from sympathetic neurons. And throughout his work, throughout his life, it was important work coming out of the SKOK lab at the Bogomolets Institute. It was my great fortune in the early 2000s to have a small grant with Vladimir, which enabled him to come visit us in Pittsburgh and enabled me to visit Kyiv and see the Institute. I truly regret that I can't be here today with you in person because of the horrible war that you're living through. I want you to be assured that in the United States, we are very, very aware of the terrible things that the Russian nation has tried to do to Ukraine. And we are with you in spirit, and our government is supplying you with material to protect your freedom, and we are in awe of your desire to be free and to fight for the things that are right. So on this celebration of Vladimir Volodymyr SKOK, who would have been 90 this year, I join you and I wish you all the very best. And I certainly hope that in coming times, peace will return to your country and that we will be able to work together in person once again. So God bless you all and have a good celebration.
Це був професор Джон Форд медичного інституту США. А ми йдемо далі і зараз подивимось відеовиступ професора Пітера Сміта, який є почесним професором університету Альберти в Едмонтоні, Канада. Поділиться своїми враженнями про своє співробітництво із Володимиром СКОКом. Увага на екран.
My name is Peter Smith. I'm an emeritus professor at the University of Alberta in Edmonton, Canada. I had long known about the work done by Professor SKOK on ganglionic transmission. And in the mid-1980s, Professor SKOK visited Dr. Alan North in the United States, and we were hoping that we would be able to get him into Canada for a visit at that time. But paperwork and bureaucracy and politics prevented that from happening. But we did manage to put together a visit at a later date. Now, as you will all know, Professor SKOK's work was on ganglionic transmission, and we had similar interests, but most of Professor SKOK's work was involved with nicotinic transmission in the autonomic ganglia, and we also did publish on that. But our prime interest was in slow synaptic transmission, later becoming M channels and muscarinic effects. And although Professor SKOK didn't think these slow synaptic responses were very important, he was willing to send us a couple of people from his lab over the years to investigate them. The first was Alexander Solyanko, who unfortunately passed away a few years back from colon cancer. And Alexander visited us in the mid-1980s when wholesale recording and patch clamping was really still in its infancy. And he developed those techniques in our lab way back then that we continued to use until the lab closed about 3 or 4 years ago. Another person that came to visit us was another person from Professor SKOK's lab, Alexander Ivanov, and he did some in vivo work. All our work at that time was done on amphibians, but he was able to present some data to suggest that the slow synaptic potentials in autonomic ganglia are quite important in terms of autonomic physiology. After that time, Professor SKOK was able to visit us a couple of times. The first time was in 1991. There was a ganglionic transmission a symposium as part of the IBRO meeting in Montreal. And he was able to visit us again in 2003 at the International Society for Autonomic Neuroscience, which was held in Calgary, about 300 kilometers away from Edmonton. So Professor SKOK was very fond of visiting Canada and particularly going to the Rocky Mountains. But the first little story that I have to tell about him was when we visited a game reserve called Elk Island, which is about 30 kilometers east of Edmonton. And this game reserve had an abundant herd of bison. And Professor SKOK had never seen bison, so he was quite intrigued. So when we came to a clearing and could see some bison, Professor SKOK immediately jumped out of the car with his camera in his hand and started to pursue and investigate the bison. Well, this was all very, very well and good until the bison decided to investigate Professor SKOK. I think it's fortunate for him that he was a bit of an athlete, because he ran very quickly, being chased by a large bison. These animals are about 2 meters high at the shoulder. Another story relating to Professor SKOK relates to my first visit to Kyiv in the late 1980s, when Ukraine was still part of the Soviet Union. So Professor North had previously given some computers to the institute, Bogomolets Institute, and Western computers were fairly rare in the Soviet Union in the mid to late 1980s. So I decided I could help them out by bringing a dot matrix printer to the institute. So I wasn't quite sure what was going to happen in customs. You know, I was a Westerner, and things between the West and the Soviet Union were a little bit tense in those days. So I bought the printer and went to the first customs guy, and he looked at it and he wasn't sure what to do about it, because, you know, back then in the Soviet times, printers were very scary objects because they could be used to make propaganda leaflets and things like that. So the first junior customs guy, he was very nice, he was Ukrainian, of course, and he didn't know quite what to do. So he called the next seniority of officer, I guess something like the corporal, and he also didn't know what to do, you know, what the regulations were about importing a printer. So after that, they went and got the big boss. So the big boss, you know, had the big hat with all the decorations on it. And the big boss sort of looked at me and said, "Is this for you, or is it for the Institute?" So it was in fact actually for the Institute, which I confirmed. And then he said, "Is there anyone here visiting you, picking you up from the Institute?" And Professor SKOK came in, showed his academician card, and all the customs guys were, and so I had no problem importing my printer into Ukraine. So a couple of stories then about Professor SKOK. I can say, rest in peace, Professor SKOK, and rest in peace knowing that your scientific and personal legacy will persist long after your passing. Slava Ukraini.
Дуже веселий чоловік. Ну а ми йдемо далі, друзі. Подивимося відео-виступ про свою співпрацю з Володимиром Скориком. Що розкаже доктор Елспет Маклахлан, почесний професор Університету Нового Південного Уельсу, Австралія.
Thank you all very much for inviting me to come to speak at this meeting. I'm very honored to be here to remember the wonderful achievements of Vladimir SKOK and his laboratory, which have reverberated around the world, including including to my countries of Australia and now Scotland. I want to start by saying a few words about the war in Ukraine and how distressed we are in both countries, in both Sydney and in Glasgow, about the terrible things that are happening in east of your country and even impinging in Ukraine, in Kyiv. We really hope that something will happen soon, that Mr. Putin will stop. I'm very honoured to be here to remember the wonderful achievements of Vladimir SKOK and his laboratory, which have reverberated around the world, including to my countries of Australia and now Scotland. I want to start by saying a few words about the war in Ukraine and how distressed we are in both countries, in both Sydney and in Glasgow, about the terrible things that are happening in east of your country and even impinging in Ukraine, in Kyiv. We really hope that something will happen soon. I'm very honoured to be here to remember the wonderful achievements of Vladimir SKOK and his laboratory, which have reverberated around the world, including to my countries of Australia and now Scotland. I want to start by saying a few words about the war in Ukraine and how distressed we are in both countries, in both Sydney and in Glasgow, about the terrible things that are happening in east of your country and even impinging in Ukraine, in Kyiv. We really hope that something will happen soon, that Mr. Putin will stop.
Дякую, це був доктор Макаплан. Ми йдемо далі. Своїми враженнями від роботи із Володимиром Скоком поділиться його учениця, колишня співробітниця інституту, яка зараз проживає у Канаді. Доктор Міла Емеральд, засновник і генеральний директор фітоцентру.